Hey everyone. Almost late. Working on open source until the absolute last second. Give me a second to collect myself. I'll show you in a moment what I was working on. Let me get up the chat here on my trusty phone. I almost have my new setup at my house. We're still at the office. I almost have the setup at my house with a new recording setup. It's going to be really cool. I'll show it to everyone once I have it going. There we go. Let me silence my phone. Where are my comments? I'm getting too comfortable doing this. Come on, Ryan. All right. View channel. There we go. I see 18 people watching me struggle with my phone to get this up. There we go. So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited today to do some JavaScript. As usual, I like to start off with a little news, little good news. I don't have anything fun to share this week about playing video games with my 7-year-old or anything like that. But on the nerd front, let's move this over here. We did get a release out this week, so if you're watching the Symfony UX world, we did get 2.14.1 out. So yay, 2.14 was a huge release. We got that out last week. I think I talked about that last week. And we only broke one thing, so that's actually pretty good for about 3 months of development. So 2.14.1 is out. You probably also noticed nothing to do with Symfony UX, but something that's kept me busy this week and lots of people busy this week are the new Doctrine major releases. So it was Doctrine ORM release 3 came out, ta-da, over the weekend. And then Doctrine DBall version 4 came out. Really probably boring changes for most people. The change logs on these are massive. The amount of backwards compatibility breaks that were inside of these. I think it's under the upgrade log. Yeah, BC break, BC break, BC break, BC break, BC break. You see my scroll bar here? See how far we are down? So probably not stuff that's going to hopefully affect the end user that much, but if you maintain open source libraries, it's been a busy week. We got a maker bundle out release yesterday with a bunch of changes. It's good stuff though. I mean, Doctrine is one of the oldest high quality PHP libraries. You have to remember, Doctrine 2 really came out more or less like right when PHP namespaces were invented. So there's all kinds of patterns in PHP that over the next 10 plus years have changed. So this is just good cleanup stuff. So congrats to them. And you know, it's been a busy week to update the open source libraries, but it's happening. Easy Admin also, I saw, got a release this morning for their new Doctrine support. And let's see, I'm going down my list here. I see Kevin in the chat there. Hey, Kevin. I'll talk about you for a second. Something I've talked about a little bit, but we haven't got it yet, is we now have a pull request for an icons library inside of Symfony. So a lot of conversation on this, so check this out. If you have any opinions on how this should work, I still need to review this. But the idea is, you know, we all need icons on our site, right? The best practice for icons is actually to output them as SVGs. So if you're like me, historically, you've added the font awesome style template in here. Here we go. I've used font awesome. There's actually someone at my office that works at font awesome. So we've historically done the FA dash, you know, whatever, thumbs up type of deal. Not a span, but, or a div, something like that, right? That still totally works. But the best practice these days is actually to render an inline SVG. And so that's what that library is going to do, is you're going to be able to, you know, get Font Awesome or get some other font library and then access its, if you want to use a Twig component, access its icons with something like this. Name equals font awesome : thumbs up. And what you're going to get there is literally an SVG icon. That's what's going to render on the page. And of course, it's SVG. You can control its size. It's good for accessibility. Lots and lots of good stuff. So very, very excited about that. It's going to simplify our setup on Symfony Casts. Because it also means that your users are only going to download the icons they need. On SymphonyCast, we previously were giving you a CSS file and a font file that just had every icon known to man for Font Awesome. So it was this really big download. And then recently we removed that because we were just slowing the site down. And instead we used Font Awesome, but we had to select the exact icons we wanted. So every time we wanted to use a new icon on the site, we would have to like go to Font Awesome and like check a box so they would start serving it to us and then go back to our site. So not an ideal situation. So I'm excited to use that library. Which library is the icon library inspired by? Is it a bit like Tailwind's hero icons or more Font Awesome? It is, good question. Oh yeah, you see how it works. Yeah, so it's agnostic to the actual hero library. You'll be able to use it with Font Awesome or hero icons or whatever. It's just a mechanism to be able to grab those SVGs in a really easy way and then bring them into your app. So it's kind of a, in a good way, an underwhelming solution, an underwhelming feature. It's just something we need, and it's not that complex to solve, but we shouldn't all have to solve it. And I've talked to multiple people that have created their own Twig icon system like this, like their own Twig component. And I've even seen people, actually maybe these people were me, I can't remember, but me and maybe other people have even inside of this kind of icon Twig component they created in their project, basically had an if statement, been like, if name equals Font Awesome thumbs up, then here's this SVG. Else if the name is this, here's this SVG. So kind of rolling this system manually on a case-by-case basis, which is just kind of lame. And that's a lot of what the Symfony UX stuff is about, right? It's not complex stuff. It's just things that would take me an hour to solve and you an hour to solve and somebody else an hour to solve. And that's just silly. We need to have centralized solutions and share stuff so that it takes us all 5 minutes instead of 1 hour. All right, let's see what else on my list here. I got my good news list. If anyone has some good news to share, any successes, I would love to see those. Pop those on there. One thing, what I was just doing right before, the reason I was almost late, was this little update. This is also a pull request from Kevin. This is about the new attributes syntax. We're kind of settling on the new attribute syntax for Twig, so hopefully we'll get this merged pretty soon. So it's kind of a small thing, but just to make the printing out the attributes on your root Twig component a little bit more friendly. We've talked about this a few times on the screencast or on this live cast, so it's getting closer, and hopefully we can push this forward and push it over the edge. And last week we worked on the Twig UI recipes, the UI components. The update on that is hopefully, I haven't had more time to work on it. Hopefully in a week or so, we will start sharing that work publicly, that private repository I showed you, so that we can solidify what recipes and components we want to have as a version 1 and then get that moving towards production. This week, I'm going to work on basically a section on the site. So it's going to live on ux.symfony.com. I don't know, maybe /recipes. So we have enough of these done now where I think we can take the requirements for what each recipe is. You know, it's a stimulus component and it's a Twig template, and optionally it might have CSS. So we kind of have the ingredients, no pun intended, for these recipes. And so I'm going to take this to our designers and hopefully get a nice, really nice new section put out for that. So we use, by the way, Locastic for our design. So they're a design company. You know, we pay them money. SymphonyCast sponsors the design for ux.symfony.com, but they're a really great company. So if you need design or something, you can check them out. So they'll be doing the design for the new section, which I'm really excited about. Oh, that's a good news. Kevin Bond, ZenStruct Foundry 2.0 is super, super close. All right, Kevin, in the chat, you have your 30 seconds worth of chat for your elevator pitch. So you got to tell everybody in the chat why they should care about ZenStruct 2. I know a little bit, but I probably only know a small bit of why I should be excited about version 2. All right, while you do that, let's get to work. So what we're going to be doing today, and I didn't talk as long as I normally do, so we have some time to do some work, is the live component JavaScript internals. And I created a pull request last week. So backing up here, live components is almost definitely going to become stable at the end of February. So Symfony UX in general, we've moved to a once a month release. So near the end of the month, we'll have a new release. If we need a bug fix release in the middle of a month, we'll do that. We did that last week. But as far as like new features, once a month. So at the end of February, we should be getting out the release that would have live components stable. As part of that, it's got me thinking, what are the things that I want to break before then, before we have to stop breaking things? And one thing that came to mind was the JavaScript internals, just some cleanup. These would be arguable backwards compatibility breaks because no one really uses a lot of this stuff directly, but even still, now is kind of the time to do it. So I have a work in progress pull request from last week that I basically just want to continue. So let me get this pulled down. And let's see, what's my branch name here? Live internals JS tweaks. So you can check out this pull request if you want to. There we go. Let's rebase on origin 2.x just in case. Cool. Awesome. We're also going to get a little tour here into how the live components JavaScript works, because there's no specific thing about this that I was going for this pull request other than just looking in there, and now that the JavaScript's been around for a while, saying what are the cleanups? What things can we make better inside of here? So inside live components asset source, here is all the TypeScript, JavaScript behind everything. Oh, here we go. Good news from Ryan. Hey Ryan, from Ryan. My good news is that my PR from last week was approved. You and Nicholas were super helpful in the issue PR, so now I've officially contributed to Symfony. That is good news. Congratulations. That is not an easy thing to accomplish. Oh yeah, brand new type component has made it into Symfony. So I tweeted about that. It's like a low-level component, but that's just a really great thing. There are increasingly places in Symfony where we need to look at a property or an argument and get type information about it, which seems kind of simple, right? Like you just use reflection and look at, you know, if you wanted to know like information about this property, right? Like just use reflection. It tells you this is a property access or interface. It turns out to be a lot more complicated than that. Sometimes you have union types. Sometimes you have arrays, but then there's some like PHP documentation above here that tells you that's an array of some other object. And there's many, many, many other things. So having that low level type info component is going to be really, really useful. And I opened this class, this live component hydrator. This is the class that's responsible for taking your component objects and taking the live props on them and transforming those values into something we can send to the front end. And then when you make an AJAX call, taking those values and transforming them back. So for example, if one of your live props is a doctrine entity, the live component hydrator takes your entity's ID, sends it to the front end, and then when the ID gets sent back, it transforms it back into the entity by querying the database for it. So this class relies heavily on not that component yet because it's brand new, but the code that led to that component, basically the existing pieces in Symfony that have now been formalized into that type info component. We rely entirely for this dehydration process on your property types in your components. So we're reading those to figure out, you know, what is this thing that I need to hydrate? Oh, it's an entity, so okay, I'll query the database. So yeah, really excited about that. All right. Oh yeah, first official release for the Storybook bundle next week. Oh, I will do that during my talk. Brave man, that is awesome. So if you haven't seen that yet, I can't remember. I've seen it. I can't remember if it's public yet, Mateo. You can put a link if it is public. But if you've seen Storybook before, it's going to be a great partner with Twig Components. And you know, Mateo, we really need to make sure that is something we feature prominently, maybe like in the Twig Component documentation with the link, maybe on ux.symfony.com. So we can have a version of that so you can actually maybe see and play with it. Instead of that being something that is a great bundle that you kind of need to find on your own. It just fits so well with Twig Components. All right, so let's hop into our JavaScript here. So everything starts with this live controller. Oh, that's right, another good one, yeah. Turbo 8 is coming this week. It will not, yeah, so Turbo 8 is coming this week, has lots of new features, but I don't think I'm not aware of any backwards compatibility breaks or any significant ones. So I don't think that it's going to be a problem integrating it. It just got a release candidate 3 yesterday. Oh, look at that. Never mind. It's released right now. Holy moly, 5 hours ago. You go to sleep and, you just miss the world. So yeah, to your question, what do we need to do to integrate that with Symfony? Maybe we'll do it right now because it's already done, I think. There we go. There are no backwards compatibility breaks that I'm aware of. It's mostly just some really great new features. So the only thing that we need to do is when you compose and require Symfony UX Turbo, you automatically get Turbo added to your import map.php file or your package.json file if you're using Webpack Encore, but it's going to add it at version 7. And the reason is because inside Turbo, actually I can show you over here in the actual code, inside any of the Symfony UX packages, there's a little kind of fake JavaScript package with a package.json file. And inside of here, we advertise what third-party libraries that you need to have in your application. And Symfony Flex is what uses this when you install Symfony UX Turbo. It reads this, and it's because of this line here that it adds Turbo to your package.json file or to your import map. So this pull request over here just changes that to 7.1 or 8. We hadn't merged it yet because as soon as we merge this, people that install Symfony UX Turbo are going to start getting version 8, which is fine now, but back when it was just beta, right, that wasn't fine. So people were going to be getting the beta version. But now let's merge this. So we're not going to release it immediately. Okay. So let's go here, and I'm on my branch. I'm going to lose my branch here. Let me just copy this. So I'll use the top secret internal merging tool called GH. Mine's alias to SGH, but it's usually called GH. That's what the core Symfony team uses for merging things. So we're going to merge 1317. This is going to be a feature, so it needs to go on a minor release, push the changes, and that's it. Ta-da! So it's not released yet, but if you're using the latest version of Symfony UX Turbo, you can now get Turbo 8. And of course, you could always change your package.json or your import map.php from 7 to 8. The annoying thing is that next time you install the package, Symfony Flex would change it back to a version that's compatible with Symfony UX. That's done that way on purpose. We want to make sure that we keep your Turbo version at a version that matches what Symfony UX Turbo says it supports. Cool. Turbo 8 is out. Awesome. Okay, let's see here. Yeah, same happens with UX swap. It wants, I think, version 2 while 3 is out, and this messes things up when updating the dependencies. Yep, that's really kind of our main job with some of these packages. Cool. All right. Back to the task at hand, and let me get back on my branch here. All right. So welcome to the live components JavaScript. It all starts with a stimulus controller. And this is already going to be a little bit broken because I stopped right in the middle of my refactoring, so you might see some things that are red inside of here. And it looks like there's a lot of imports, but really the live components JavaScript, what it does is fairly simple. So this is just going to look just like your code, right? This is just a stimulus controller called live controller. And we have a bunch of values that we pass in. So we pass in a name of your component, which is matches your actual Twig component name. The URL is going to be the URL that it's going to make the AJAX recalls to. Here's your props, so the dehydrated version of your props. And that's basically it. There's other settings like debounce. Fingerprint is a super internal thing. Query mapping is for the new feature where the URL changes. But the vast majority of these are kind of extra features on there. The big thing is it's a controller that you pass props to, and you pass a URL that live components will make an AJAX call to in order to update and re-render the element. So, and a lot of stuff here is just TypeScript stuff. So this is just to make TypeScript happy. And let's go down here a little bit. All right. So really what I've been looking at with this is the live controller doesn't actually do that much. So, I mean, it's kind of long, but it's about 400 lines long, which considering all the things that live components does is not really that big, because the vast majority of things are actually done by a component object, which was done this way by design. I wanted to push as much of the functionality into this pure component JavaScript object that you can actually interact with in JavaScript if you want to. So in initialize, which is a stimulus controller thing, that's what we do. We basically grab, we create this new component object and we set it onto a component property. And then we set a couple other things like listeners. This stuff down here is really not that important. And then you may or may not know, but Live Components actually has a plugin system, which is how we get a whole bunch of extra functionality in there. But anyway, this component is what I've been cleaning up. So I want to load into there. Because in theory, I want to get the system from an architectural standpoint as close to possible as being able to manually, if you wanted to, instantiate a component object on an element and have it work. I want it to not feel like there's all these weird layers and you need this live controller. I want to be like, no, it's just kind of like, it's just down to this component object. If you wanted to, you could create this, point it at an element, pass it some props, and you could actually have that work like a real live component that makes AJAX calls. So what we're passing to this component, the constructor, is what I was looking at. So if we think about it, what is a live component? It's an element. It's an element that has some state, which we call props. And then it is something that needs to be able to make it it's something that needs to be able to re-render itself when those props change. Now we're talking about an AJAX call, right? It needs to make an AJAX call somewhere to be able to re-render itself. But on a more abstract level, in theory, it doesn't even need to be an AJAX call. In theory, you could create a component object, point it at an element, give it some props, and potentially pass it some other system where when those props change, instead of it making an AJAX call, it does some other mechanism, like it renders from a JavaScript template. I'm not saying that this is going to be a main use case, but it's the kind of flexibility that I think that this object should have. So let's see here. We pass, the arguments right now are the element, which makes sense. The name, which is really unfortunate. This is only needed in one place in Live Components. And that is if you, let me get up the documentation. Emitting events. Let's see here. Listening to events, passing data to events, scoping events. Here it is right there. This is the only place that the component name is needed. So kind of an extra unfortunate thing, but it's probably worth keeping in there. And that is the idea that you could dispatch an event called product added, but you only want to dispatch that to your product list component or product list components on your page. You don't want to emit a product added event to every component. I'm having a hard time thinking of a spot where I would have another component that happens to have a event that a event listener on an event called product added, but it's like a different product added. I don't know. Anyway, that's why that name thing exists. But I'm not sure that it's totally necessary. And my goal here is to really slim this down as much as possible. That's why that name kind of bothers me, but we'll probably keep it. Next argument is props, which makes sense. And then fingerprint. I won't talk too much about that. This has to do with child elements. We keep track of, when you render your components, whatever you pass into your component, those props that you pass in when you render it, we create a fingerprint from those. So we create a string that is unique to that combination of input props. And this is important because it allows us to figure out when a parent component re-renders, whether or not the child component needs to re-render. Because normally when a parent component re-renders, we don't re-render the child components. The parent and the child live independently of each other. However, if the parent component re-renders and the inputs to that child changed, and you have this special option on one of the properties of your child called update from parent, then we re-render the child, and the fingerprint has is kind of the key behind making that happen. There's an ID here, and then we have backend interface and element driver, and these are kind of two things I think I was working on a bit. So the backend interface is the part I'm talking about where we have something that re-renders the components. So if I click and open that, yeah, so right now it actually has make request, which is kind of, its name is tied to Ajax. But the idea is that the components object is not aware of how the rendering happens, how the update happens, how the Ajax call happens. It's offloaded to this backend object that we can control, which I'm not going to look at too much right now. And then the last thing here was this element driver. So another goal of this, which I'm kind of going back and forth on. An initial goal of this component class was to have it be unaware of your HTML attributes. So what I mean is, actually open this up and I'll show you what this is. Actually, let me go over to my pull request because I think I already stripped some things out of here. Boop, I did. Actually, not too much yet. So here's an example. When you make an Ajax call, and inside of your Ajax call, like you make an Ajax call for a live action. Let's say that inside of your live action, you omit something. There we go. Right? You say, I want to emit an event called product added. The way that's communicated down to the front end is when your component is re-rendered, we include this information that you want to emit an event called product added on an HTML attribute of your outer component element. And then after the re-render finishes, the system reads that attribute and then goes and emits that event. So one of the things that this element driver, which is an interface in JavaScript, does is it has a get events to emit method. And this is called during the re-rendering process by the component object. And if you look at the default implementation, so we were looking at an interface a second ago. This is the actual main concrete class that implements the interface. What we do is we read a element.dataset.live emit. So what we're doing is we're reading a data-live-emit argument or attribute. So that's the convention. The server is going to put the information on that attribute, and then we're going to read it from here. So initially, I have isolated these types of things, these things that are aware of what the attributes are named to an element driver. I've since kind of been questioning that a little bit, and maybe making those more of a convention that just is hard-coded inside of the component object. I don't know, that's kind of stuff that I'm feeling out right now. All right, so let me go over here and kind of remember, what I was doing here. So let's trace through and so get component props. Cool, let's look at that real quick. Sorry, I'm jumping around, but then I'm gonna explain what's going on. Get component props with no arguments. Let's see here. What were you thinking 5 days ago when you worked on this, Ryan? Okay. Element driver. Putting myself back in my shoes. I can see I'm removing a bunch of these element arguments. So what was I? Oh. to do, make this part of an options array, file, child, component, elements, yes. Oh, yeah. I think I remember now. Yes, I think I remember now. Instead of, so one of the weird things about the way things are set up now is I was leveraging these. Actually, this is a great example here. So this get component props, so like to walk you through what happens here is when a component finishes re-rendering, the live component JavaScript needs to get the new state of the props. So the whole cycle goes like this. User updates some props, maybe because they type into an input box, right? Ajax request is sent. That sends those new props. So when the user updates these props, these are now updated on the client side. So our JavaScript is now aware that we have updated a name prop to something. So an Ajax request is sent that sends those new props to the server. Server responds with the new HTML and the new props. Now this might seem redundant, right? Because you're like our JavaScript is already aware that, for example, name changed to Ryan. Like, all right, so why would the server need to respond with the fact that the name was changed to Ryan, right? Because it already knows that. The reason is that one of the things that you're allowed to do inside of your PHP component is change the live props. So you could trigger a live action, for example, and then in that live action, you could just change a prop. And so we need to get that backwards towards, we need to send that back to the front end. So it might be that the server is actually going to respond, and now the name is set to Kevin. And so we need to read that after the re-rendering process to synchronize that to basically let our JavaScript know that the name prop is now set to Kevin. So this get component prop method, if we look at the component object, really the main method, I'm going to scroll up here. Sorry, I will explain this as we go. So to walk through really like the guts of this class are when it makes the Ajax request. So this is actually, without going into the backend response stuff, this is actually the spot inside of the component object where it makes the Ajax call to the backend. And the backend returns with HTML. So that's actually the format that's going across the wire. We're not sending JSON back and forth. We're just sending HTML, or the server is responding with our new HTML component. So after a couple of basic checks, we go into this process re-render. And this is really the meat of what Live Components does. So at this point, we have the existing HTML on the page, and the server has just sent us back the new HTML. So our job is to take that new HTML and put it onto the page, but also do a couple of other things, like, for example, grabbing the new props from the server, or as we saw a second ago, grabbing information about which events should be emitted and then emitting those. So inside here, we trigger a hook that just allows someone to hook into the process. This is where we check to see if the response was actually a redirect. If you redirect from a live action, then we'll redirect. We trigger another hook, which actually is responsible for ending the loading state. And I'm going to skip past that part. Here we go. And down here, this is where we're grabbing the new prop information. So again, the server we may have changed a live prop on the server, so we need to get that information here. So historically, what I've done is I've called this .element driver .get component props, and I've passed it the new element. So the new element at this point is representing that new HTML. And then on that get component props, this is where we're effectively reading the data live props value attribute. So hopefully you can kind of see the picture of what happens here. On initial page load, your component renders with a data live props value. So an initial render. Actually, let's get an example of this up so we can kind of see what I'm talking about. Make that a little bit bigger. All right. So let's see here. Where is my component? Inside here. There we go. There we go. So this is the root element of my package. And you can see here, one of the attributes we have is data live props value. So that's just a normal stimulus value. And so when the component re-renders, this new HTML is sent back to us. But this time, the data, it's probably going to have a new data live props value on it. And so that's why during the re-rendering process, we would call this get component props, and it would read this property. So the weird thing about this is that on initial page load, we are using normal stimulus functionality to grab the props value. So down here, we can just say this dot props value. We're not manually parsing the data live props value anywhere, because we don't need to. That's just like a stimulus thing that you do. We can just call this dot props value. But then when it re-renders, suddenly we're in a spot where we're not aware that stimulus even exists. And so inside of the component object, we need some way to kind of do that same thing, which is why we call this get components prop thing. And that's the whole reason the element driver existed in the first place, was to try to not have to hard code these conventions inside of there. Anyway, a long way of saying that inside of the component object, the idea, I think, is that this element driver thing that we're passing inside of here, I actually want to make, instead of creating a totally new object, let me show you over here. So over here, this is the argument here for the, well, I've got things out of order now because I've been doing some refactoring. Let's see here. This argument, before I reordered some arguments, this is the standard element driver. So this is the default class that implements the element driver. It's the one that has that data live props value inside of it. So the thinking is, instead of doing that and doing that parsing a second time, let's just pass this. So what if we just pass our controller in and we make our controller implement that interface? So let's see here, implement a live controller and backend interface. And I honestly don't know if this is going to be the final solution or not. So it implements backend interface, and looks like I need to have a bunch of methods. So the reason I was removing inside of my element driver, I was removing, like, this used to have a an element, HTML element on top of it, is that we don't need that anymore. If we're just passing in, if the entire stimulus controller is our element driver, then it's already aware of what its component props are. So for example, let's see here. Let's actually implement some of these methods. So I'm going to change the order of this later. But can I go to, let's see here, element driver needs get component props, any. Whoops. Hello, typo. There we go. There we go. I have to switch the language. Am I using PHP or JavaScript? Where's that curly brace go? So inside of get component props, we can now just return props value. And so over here, I'm not even going to need that standard element driver anymore. I'm going to leave it temporarily just so I can read from it and kind of steal from it. All right, perfect. And then this .element driver get component props. We're not going to pass it the 2L anymore. Okay, so this time, so this .element driver .get component props. Let's think about this here. Let me think here. This is exactly the method that we're working on. Okay, we have this in a couple places. So let's actually work down here. So this is inside of the process re-render. So this is the only question here, is I want to get the new props. And yeah. Okay, so the tricky part here is that At this point right here, new element represents the new HTML, but it's not on the page yet. So if we say this.element.getComponentProps, that's going to be getting the component properties for the current element that is actually on the page. So that's going to actually be getting the component props for the existing element that's on the page. We want the new props. So a key to making this work is that this code here needs to move down. And I actually already verified last week that this is going to be okay. This is actually the line right here where all the magic happens. So we've made the AJAX call, we've got the HTML back, and we need to put the HTML onto the page. One of the key things with live components is it doesn't just put the HTML onto the page, it doesn't just replace the HTML onto the page. Instead, it morphs it onto the page, which means it takes the existing HTML and it finds the differences and it updates it. So that's what this execute morphdom thing is. That's its own somewhat complicated class, but it's mostly just using an external library. It's actually not using morphdom anymore. We need to rename that. It's using idiomorph, but it's using a third-party library that it's really good at doing that diff. The point is, by the time we get down here, the new HTML is now on the page. So if you think about it from a live components perspective, the live component, from a stimulus controller perspective, so our stimulus controller is just sitting here. So this is a stimulus controller, right? When we re-render this, I'll actually do it right now. I can type into it. What happened internally is this component didn't get removed and re-added. It was actually mutated. It was actually changed. And if you look at this data live props value inside of here, that will actually change as I'm typing. So this props value is actually changing. And forgetting about live components, stimulus controllers are aware of when their prop value changes. So if you're just working inside of a stimulus controller and you call this.props value, that's always going to be giving you the latest version of that value based on what the underlying attribute is. So at this point, the new data live props value has been mutated on the page, and so our stimulus controller should now be aware of what that new value is, and so we can just call this.elementDriver.getComponentProps. We're just basically asking the live component, hey, what's your new props value at this point? And we don't need to do the parsing like we did a second ago. All right, so this is all well and good, but there was one other usage of this, which hopefully doesn't ruin my party. Oh, with no arguments. There we go. All right, update from new element from parent render. Oh, parent rendering. This is tough stuff. Called during morphdom. So called during, I'm going to say morphing. Read props from 2L and re-render if necessary. All right. So what's happening here is, let me think. Called during morphdom. Let me actually open up the morphdom file. Here we go. So here's the file. It's not that long that handles all of that morphing. Mostly it's done, as I mentioned, by a third-party library. Let's see where this method is being called from. Okay, it's actually 2 spots. Let's go up here first. All right. Actually, maybe I'll check the other spot. I'm trying to find the easier spot first. All right, child component map. Let's see here. I wrote all this code, but child component handling is tricky. So, all right, let's back up here and take it piece by piece. So the way idiomorph works is it mutates, it changes the existing HTML. Cool. When it does that, you can hook into the process. So this before node morphed is a spot where we have a existing element from the old HTML, and we've matched up with a new element from the new HTML, and they're different, so we're actually going to morph the 2L onto the from L. So we're going to be changing it. So this actually happens on the root element or any element inside that's changed. So what's going to happen in this case is we're doing all kinds of checks in here for all kinds of different edge cases. But let's see if we go back down to where we're looking now that I know where we are. So we're checking if child component map has from L. So it's checking to see if the element that we are, So if we're rendering a parent component, so imagine we have a div here, which is the parent component. There we go. And then there's another element inside of it for a child, div child. And this is a live component. So it's like data controller equals live. It's got all those other things inside of it. Same thing over here. This is the root element, data controller equals live. So what's checking here is it's finding out whether or not whether or not the current element that's being mutated, whether or not the from L that's being mutated is actually a child component. And it's not just another kind of random span here. So is this just an element that's being mutated, or is this element representing a child component? So that's that child component map is checking to see if this from L is a child component. And then we grab the child component, and then it's saying update from new element from parent re-render, and it's passing 2L. So let's go back over here. All right, so it's passing us the 2L, so that's going to be representing the new child element. Yeah, that makes sense. It's going to be representing the new child element HTML. And then what we need to do is we actually need to grab the props off of that child. And ultimately what we're looking at is this has to do with that functionality I talked about earlier about figuring out whether or not we need to re-render. If our parent re-rendered, does the child need to re-render? Anyways, that's all kind of handled down here. What we need here is we need to figure out what that prop is. So what we really need to do, so this is why I was passing the 2L before, but that's not going to work anymore. What I really need to do is let that HTML update first. So I need to let the child component HTML actually change. And then when it does, oh man, this is cool stuff. So a lot of this, there's things bouncing in my head. A lot of this is just trying to push more functionality into standard stimulus. So thinking out loud here, we need to, and I know that I realize this is technical, and we get into the child component stuff. We are as deep into live components JavaScript as you can get. So we need to allow the 2L HTML to be rendered onto the page, so that the child elements HTML attributes are updated, like data live props value. One of the great things about messing around with things on this level is this stuff is all massively tested inside of our test suite. So once I get to where I'm going, if I break things, the test will tell me. And let's see, and we ultimately return whether or not the element is changed. And we use that down here as our return value. Yeah, that's right. If you return, remember we're inside that before node morphed callback. If you return false, then it will skip morphing that node. So we're basically saying here, hey, if the child did change, then skip morphing it because that child is going to re-render itself anyway. So let's see here. So with this new system, we would allow the child element to allow the new child HTML to be put onto the page. That would update the props. And then we need to grab those props. The reason I'm pausing here, because on a high level, what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, when the data live props value attribute changes in in a live controller on let's say on a live component element, we need to do something. In this case, for a child component, we need to check to see if we should re-render. So I'm pausing here because a native piece of functionality in Stimulus, and again, I'm trying to push things more into standard Stimulus and do less inside of live components JavaScript, is you can actually do things when your props change. So there's a way to have a hook to call a method when a, let's say, props value changes. So instead of having code deep inside of here that is kind of reading these prop changes on the child, I'm wondering if way back in live controller, we can detect the prop change there. I actually need to look up how to do this because I don't do it very often. Let's see, values, callback, probably. Change callbacks, there we go. URL value change. So this would be like props value changed. Well, that's not void. That would just be, doesn't matter what that's called, probably void. And so the idea being that Stimulus is already really good at noticing when its props change. And so could we instead just call a method into our component, something like refresh props, this dot props value. I don't know if that makes sense. So far we're inside the component trying to figure out, inside this component object, trying to watch and figure out whether, and be aware of when the props attribute is changing on an element or on a child element. And, the possibility here is just to flip that on its head and say, no, the component object, maybe it doesn't need to know about that. Maybe it can just be dumb. So if I go back to process re-render, so inside process re-render, again, on a very high level, all that process re-render is really doing is taking the new HTML and putting it onto the page. But while it does that, it's also got a couple other things it's doing. And the one we're focusing on right now is the idea that, hey, after you put the new HTML onto the page, you need to go and look on that HTML to see if the HTML has new updated prop values. So maybe this doesn't need to be in there at all, because maybe we can just let this be dumb and then let the Stimulus controller, it's aware of when the prop values changed, and then it can call a method into the component object. So this would mean is, let's see here. I'm going to reorder these methods later because I've got everything out of order. Again, this is really just experimenting at this point. So refresh props from external change. I don't know, something like that. This would be a void. And then here would be new props right there. New props, which is going to be an any type. Refresh props from external change. There we go. Yeah, so I think I'm gonna try this approach here. So the other tricky part is that this works for the parent components, but I also have to worry about the child components, which is going to have a similar situation. I'm going to worry about the child a little bit later, I think, because that's going to get quite technical. But my hope is basically that we will not need to. So basically, with the child component, when what we want to do is allow, man, let me think about that. Props equals null. Okay. Oh no, this is actually great. Yeah, that's right. So when I was trying to remember how this works. A comment. Maybe it's simpler to distinguish props from component state, similar as in React and operate on objects. Tell me more about what you mean by that. There is I know the difference between props are kind of read-only props versus state inside of React. We use the word props, but what we're really talking about is state. These props are state. You can mutate these are mutatable things. There are some props that if you mutate them, your server will reject them because you haven't marked them as writable. But from a JavaScript perspective, they're just props, and you can just like change props and modify props. So when the server re-renders the HTML from a parent component, and this is all stuff I programmed a while ago, so I was trying to remember how it works. The child component, the server actually is smart enough to figure out whether or not the child component needs to re-render. And if the child component does not need to re-render because nothing has changed on the child that makes it re-render, then what that child component is going to look like is it's actually going to have I don't even know if it has a value. Data live-props value equals null. I don't even know if it actually has null on it, but basically, in this case, this would actually be signaling. It renders an empty element with data live props value equals null, and that signals that the child component does not need to be re-rendered. And then if it does need to be re-rendered, it's going to re-render with like the new props right here, and that's going to be a signal that the props do need to be re-rendered. So props came from the backend, and before render, there are some states in the parent-child scopes. Yeah, I'm not sure I follow. This stuff is complicated enough. If you have more details, I'm all for ideas. Yes, the tricky part here is that, and maybe this is a signal that I'm doing it the wrong way. Maybe. So what I'm kind of struggling with right here is there needs to be a way, and there is currently, but I'm trying to make things a little more pure with stimulus. And I'm probably going to think about this afterwards a bit more instead of trying to put this all the way through right now. There needs to be a way for the parent component to re-render a child and say this child component just needs to be left untouched. And as I mentioned, right now the way we do that is by data live props value equals null. The problem with that, with my new kind of cleaner architecture, is that I can't let the child component re-render with the data live props equals value equals null, because we don't really want to change the child's props to null. It's really just more of a signal that's saying, hey child, you don't need to re-render itself. So if we let the child re-render, this is actually going to replace their props entirely. So we need some other signal on this element that we can look at from right here when the parent is being morphed. That tells us that that element can be left alone. And I don't know, I don't need to think about that. I mean, this might be a spot where I just make up some other attribute, even though I don't love doing that. I don't think about that. It might be, yeah, I might have to make up an attribute here like data. Something like that. I don't love that. It seems a bit made up, but that would, in theory, work. And then if this attribute were not there, then we could let the child component render itself, and we could then let the child kind of trigger its own re-rendering based on this. So I need to think about the child a bit more, but man, so yeah, that's gonna be complicated. Well, not complicated. This is why I want to do this refactoring now. Like things are, I'm fairly happy with how the internals of the JavaScript are. It's incredibly well tested, but there's just some things that are, some wires that are not as clearly separated as I would like them to be. We're really close to having just a really pure kind of component object that's very understandable and a live controller that's understandable, and just to kind of pull them apart a bit more. So I've been rambling about some really deep stuff for a while. So I'm almost out of time. I'm basically out of time, but if you stuck with me this long through the deep stuff, just want to show you maybe a couple other like small things inside of here that might be even more useful for you than thinking about the super low level details of like the child and parent component renderings. So the really kind of nice thing, and the reason that I created this component object ultimately was really for the end user. So I've been talking about this like it's an internal thing, but the component object is something that you can get inside of your code. Let's see here in the documentation. Oh, wait, here we go. So for example, if you had a custom controller, custom stimulus controller, and you attach that to the same element as your live component. Let's see, I think we talked about how to do that down here. Yeah, we do. Then you can actually grab this component object. So you can make an initialize or a connect method, and you can actually say get component, pass it this element. So the component object is attached to a specific element. So there's a component object that is attached to this root element right there, and you can grab that component object off. And what's really cool about that is it looks and feels a bit like your PHP object. You can set data on it, so you can change like the prop mode to editing. You can call render on it. You can trigger an action on it. So all these things that you are normally doing with data attributes, like you're triggering an action by adding some data attributes to a button, ultimately they're just methods on this component object. So all the public methods on this component object, not all of them, but many of the public methods on this component object are just stuff that you can use. So on and off, these are also ways for you to register hooks. Set is how you change models, and you can change a prop. You can change a prop. You can tell it that you want to re-render immediately or you want to re-render later, and so on and so forth. You can get the data of what you're for a specific prop right now. You can trigger actions. There's things for files, render. So it's just a really, really powerful way to interact with your component object if you need to do some seriously kind of custom stuff. The other thing that I think is kind of cool that's not really leveraged externally yet is this live components plugin system. So instead of putting, all right, so the loading functionality, right? You have the ability inside of live component to add a div data-loading type of thing inside of your element. And just by adding this data-loading, this is going to be hidden by default, and then it's going to be shown why your component is loading. And there's all kinds of other syntaxes for this that you can put. You can set it to a value and configure how it works, but that's all part of the loading functionality. So instead of putting that inside the component object, in part for readability, that actually exists inside of a loading plugin. And you can actually, I don't think anyone's actually done this, and it's not something that's documented. You can actually add your own plugins to your component. So you could grab the component object like we saw a second ago, and you could actually say this.component.add plugin and add your own plugin. And a plugin implements an interface. It's a really simple interface. It's just called attach to component. So every time a component gets created, this attach to component, we call that in our system, we pass the component. And then internally, it's just kind of a cool thing because it's using the hook system. So instead of having this loading functionality hard-coded inside of the component object, it's just right here. It just grabs the component and says, hey, when the loading state is started, I'm going to trigger my start loading functionality. When loading state is finished, I'm going to trigger my finish loading functionality, and so on and so forth. So we have this for a loading plugin. The polling is also a plugin. The query string, where it changes the URL when you're interacting with models, that's actually done via a plugin as well. And there are a couple of other things. All right, I'm going to be quiet. Thank you for sticking with me. That got more technical than I was expecting. Hopefully you learned something about the JavaScript internals, and it definitely helped me to muddle my way through and kind of figure out how I want things to connect. So this is something I'll be working on over the next week or two. You can watch my pull requests if you want on there, and hopefully we get something that's really nice. I'm already really happy with it. As you can see with the loading plugin, kind of proves that it's already pretty extensible, and the component object is already fairly pure. I think we can just get a little bit further, leverage a little more stimulus, and it will at least make me happier. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll do this again next week. I have no idea about what yet, if you want to talk about something. But, for me, it's just a great time to do some open source and talk through some open source chores that I have, and there's always a million things that are popping around my mind. So, see everyone later. Thanks for hanging out. Have an excellent rest of your week.